Hi, I'm Sandy Fagan, and we're here with Grammy-winning engineer and producer Glen Kolotkin, who I've known personally since 1978. Glen was awarded a Grammy for Santana's Supernatural Record of the Year in 1999 and has over 20 gold and platinum albums to his credit. Glen has spent the last 5 decades recording a myriad of artists who have helped to shape and change the course of music. In addition to recording 9 albums with Carlos Santana, hit records such as I Love Rock and Roll with Joan Jett and the Blackhearts, Electric Ladyland with Jimi Hendrix, and Pearl with Janis Joplin, just to name a few, Glen has worked with over 30 artists who are currently in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Glen, thanks for inviting us into your studio. When did you first become interested in recording?
It all started, I guess, when I was a teenager. We had a doo-wop group. I remember living in Farmingdale, New York. We were singing in the bathrooms and under overpasses and places like that. And we wanted to record ourselves, so we wanted to hear what we sounded like. Right then, tape recorders would go for like $150 each back then. And so my father bought me a Wilcox Gay disc cutting machine. That was a machine that could actually record records. It would make a 78 RPM record, and I guess was very popular in the 40s because they didn't have tape recorders back then. So he picked it up for about $10. It came with 1 microphone, and so that's how I started recording. We were recording our 4-piece group with 1 microphone. Then I needed another microphone, and I kept expanding and expanding, and that's basically what happened. And then every group in school wanted to come and make a record. So I had a recording business in the basement of my house.
And after that, when you went into the Army, didn't you get assigned to work at a radio station?
I was stationed in Germany on a radio station for 2.5 years or so.
How did you get your start as a professional recording engineer?
After I got out of the Army, I remember my Uncle Raymond came over to our house and he asked me, "What are you going to do now that you're finished with the service?" So I said, "I'd really like to get into the recording industry." And he said, "Well, why don't you get the Manhattan Yellow Pages and look up recording studios and ask if they needed any help there for someone that has your experience. After all, you do have a lot of experience on a radio station." I called up the first studio that I saw listed in the Yellow Pages, and it was A1 Sound Studios. So I called that number, and I spoke with Herb Abramson, and he said, "Come on down, well, let's have a chat." And I did come down, and we had a chat, and he hired me. And he was really my first teacher in the recording industry.
Is that when you got to work with the Four Tops?
I was there probably about 2.5 months, maybe 3 months, and the Four Tops were playing a gig in Paramount. And they came in, and I got to work with the Four Tops, having about 3.5 months of recording experience.
And from there you went to NOLA?
My second job was at NOLA Penthouse Recording Studios, and I worked for Tom Nola. It was in the Steinway building right on the penthouse, and it was really good. I got to work with practically every other day a different artist.
How did you end up at Columbia Records?
After about 1.5 years at NOLA's, I saw my grandfather, and he had told me he had read an ad in the New York Times, which he had cut out, and it said, "Major recording company looking for experienced recording engineers." So I made the call, and I showed up at Columbia Recording Studios in Manhattan.
What was your relationship like with Clive Davis?
I have Clive Davis to thank for that job, because when Clive became president of Columbia Records, he wanted more engineers to do rock and roll. Most of the engineers on staff there were doing Broadway shows, jazz, classical, and middle-of-the-road music, but he wanted some young rock and roll engineers, and I was about 22 years old at the time, so I guess I fit the bill.
Tell us about your early recording projects.
unknown groups mainly. And then one day I got a setup for a studio session, and I asked the studio manager, who's coming in? He said, I don't know who's coming in. Just set up the studio that way. Well, I did, and in walks Jimi Hendrix carrying a whole bunch of tapes under his arm. And he told me, I've been working on this album for quite a while now, and I'm not happy with it yet. And the album was Electric Ladyland.
And who else did you work in the early days?
The Rolling Stones came in, and I worked on Her Majesty's Santana Request album.
You also worked with many R&B acts, Aretha Franklin, Gladys Knight and the Pips, and Chuck Berry. What was it like working with Gamble and Huff?
At the time that I got the booking, I hadn't heard of Gamble and Huff, but I remember about 17 musicians came in, Gamble and Huff, and in walks Clive Davis and his whole staff, it seemed, and we recorded about 4 songs, and they blew me away. I mean, I love the way those guys were writing tunes, and they were really the best. After the session, they told me that they were getting an independent label, and they're going to be stationed in Philadelphia, the place where I was born. Do I want to come and work with them? But I really didn't want to leave New York at the time.
While in New York, you also worked with Simon and Garfunkel, Johnny Mathis, Donovan, Neil Diamond, and Chicago.
Interesting working with Simon and Garfunkel. Of course, I knew them because they were there recording ever since I was working for Columbia Records, so I got to know them a little. And I did a lot of work with them on their TV tracks. I remixed their TV tracks, and they were doing their vocals live.
How did you end up in L.A.?
One day, the manager of the Los Angeles studios for Columbia Records was in, and I got to meet him. And I asked him, I said, look, if there's ever an opening in L.A., I'd really be interested in coming down. And he said, yeah, there is an opening, so come on down. And I did.
What was it like recording with Barbra Streisand?
People ask me about Barbra Streisand, what she's like. And I said, if you ever saw Funny Girl, that's what she's like. She played herself.
How did you come to work with Janis Joplin?
Janis Joplin came to me via Clive Davis again. He recommended that I work with Janis Joplin. It's really funny because when I first joined Columbia Records, I was doing some editing of a group that was recorded live. And I asked the producer, what's the name of the group? They said it was Big Brother and the Holding Company. And I didn't know that of Janis Joplin at the time or the group. And I edited Piece of My Heart, which turned out to be her first hit. Then, of course, I found out about Janis, who she was. And it was great working with her. She was incredible. I really became very close with her. And that was on the Pearl album, which was her last album.
You also got to work with Neil Young and Joni Mitchell in L.A.
They were working on the Eric Anderson album that I was working with, and that's how I got to work with them.
How did you get to work with Santana?
When I got to San Francisco, Santana was recording at the studio there, but they were working with the engineer that had done their last album. And one day he got sick and he asked me to do him a favor and to fill in for him. And they were in the middle of doing live recording in the studio. I started recording them, and their road manager got on the phone to call their manager, said, come on down. Their manager, a guy named Stan Markham, came down. The band loved the way it sounded, so I just continued working with them. I did apologize to the other engineer, but he says, I can't stand working with them anyway. I've had it with working with them, so have fun. And I did, for 9 albums.
How did you meet Billy Graham?
Bill Graham was an amazing person. He was the biggest promoter out in San Francisco, for sure. And he would come down to the studio a lot. Every time, I guess, one of his bands would be appearing at the Fillmore West and a place called Winterland. Bill Graham wanted to manage Santana, and so he was coming down to a lot of Santana sessions.
And at that time, you also worked with Journey, right?
Yeah, after maybe the second or third album that I did with Santana, Herbie Herbert, the guy that was Santana's road manager, put together this band called Journey. And actually, I didn't work on their first album, but I produced and engineered their second album called Look Into the Future.
And in San Francisco, didn't you also get to work with Sly Stone and Joan Baez?
Yeah, I remember Sly, we did some studio work, and Joan, I did a live album, a thing called Live at Big Sur, and it was her and many other very popular groups like Blood, Sweat and Tears and Chris Christopherson and on and on.
And didn't you do a project with the Byrds?
Yes, I have Clive Davis to thank for that. He had heard an album that the Byrds had just completed for Columbia, but he wasn't happy with the way it sounded. So Clive asked me if I could remix it. He sent me the tapes, and I remixed it, sent him back the tapes, and Clive sent me a telegram congratulating me on the mix.
When you were in San Francisco, didn't you work with Matthew Kaufman at Berserkly Records?
Yes, Matthew Kaufman started Berserkly Records. It was an outside client, nothing to do with Columbia at all, but he was using our studios, and I was producing with Matthew Kaufman. We had 4 groups, the Reuben News, which was a teeny boppers group, and we had like a top 40 hit with them, a remake of I Think We're Alone Now. Then we had Earthquake, which was like a heavy metal band, and then we had Greg Kinn, was like sense of Billy Joel, that type of an artist, and he later had a hit called Jeopardy, which did quite well. And Jonathan Richmond was a very unique artist. We had a #1 hit with him in the UK called Egyptian Reggae.
And didn't you and Matthew go to work with Talking Heads?
Matthew Kaufman and myself flew to New York one day, and we worked with this group called the Talking Heads, which I never heard of them, but I think Matthew had seen them at CBGB's. Recorded about four tunes. We were trying to get them on Berserkly. One tune was Psycho Killer, which I loved the best of all 4, but they ended up, I believe, on Sire Records, because they offered them a better deal than we could have, being a smaller label than Sire was.
Tell us briefly about your experience with Joan Jett working on I Love Rock and Roll.
Kenny Laguna was another producer I had met through Berserkly. We were working on some stuff together, and when I had moved back to New York, he called me up and told me about a group that he was managing called Joan Jett and the Blackhearts. So I got to work with Joan and the Blackhearts. And we almost finished the album, and I had a meeting with Richie Cordell, who was one of the producers, who I later became partners with. And Kenny Laguna, I said, I don't think we have a hit here yet. Laguna says, well, Joan found a song when she was in England on a record over there, and she thinks it could be a hit. So the next day when I was setting up the studio, after I was set up, I asked the band to play that song that Joan found, and so Joan said, sure, let's run through it. So they played it, and it blew me away, and so I asked them to play it again, and this time I started the 24-track machine. I pressed record, and we got it in like the first take. It was great.
And how did you get to work with the Ramones?
The Ramones kind of came out of Joan Jett's big hit, I Love Rock and Roll, which was #1 for 8 weeks. They wanted to work with Richie Cordell and myself, who got credit on Joan's album. And so I worked on with the Ramones. Richie and I produced and I engineered the record called Subterranean Jungle. And it was really fun working with the Ramones too, especially Joey was quite the person.
And did you also work with Black Sabbath?
Yes, I worked with them. I recorded them some individually on some albums, and then with them in a live concert we worked together.
Didn't you also work with Robin Gibb of the Bee Gees?
I worked with Robin Gibb, came into Kingdom Sound one day with Jimmy Ruffin. Robin had written a song called Hold On to My Love, and Jimmy was to sing it, and he did. And while we were working on Jimmy's vocal, I had this idea that, gee whiz, since Robin Gibb wrote it, and I know he could sing, I asked Robin to sing that song for Jimmy, just to hear how he would sing it, since he wrote it. And so he did. And then we finished up Jimmy's vocal, and the record goes gold and to about number 5 on the national charts. And it seems now you could even find the version I did with Robin Gibb, which is the same backing track as Jimmy Ruffin used, but just Robin Gibb's voice on it. And it was a rough mix. It was just a guide vocal, but now someone put it up online and you could find it on YouTube.
And then you went to BMG, right?
I worked at BMG, yes I did.
And you worked with Madonna?
I worked with Madonna.
How did you get to work with Bob Seger?
I was out in Detroit doing a album with a group called the Rockets. This was a really tight band, and their manager had a friend of his who was managing Bob Seger. So Bob Seger would show up to the studio every now and then and watch our recording, and he asked me one day if he could co-produce one of the Rockets' tunes. And I said, sure, Bob Seger, why not?
You also recorded several jazz artists. What was it like to work with Miles Davis and Dave Brubeck?
It was interesting working with Dave Brubeck because of who Dave Brubeck was, and I always loved his hit Take 5, which was way before I came on the scene. What a nice guy he was. As far as Miles Davis, I was working with a guy named Tio Macero, who was Columbia's big jazz producer on a bunch of different jazz records, and Tio called me up one time when I was working in San Francisco, and he wanted to record Miles Davis at Stanford University, and that's what I did. At that time, Miles was very interested in Indian instruments for some reason, because we had sitars and tablas on that date.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with us?
Well, there's a story about Bob Seger, since we just spoke with him. Well, one day he came into the studio, it was in the winter. He was wearing a fur hat, he had a full beard, and a fur cut that went down to the floor. And we were working at a studio that was in a farm, and they had a German Shepherd. When the German Shepherd took one look at Bob Seger, didn't know whether to shoot or go blind. That's what I have to say. He ran up to Bob and started barking, then ran away as soon as Bob turned around. And this went on for about 3 minutes, and we were all on the floor laughing about it.
Thanks again for taking the time to tell us about what it was like to record with all of those music legends.
Time has come today. Young hearts can go their way. Can't put it off another day. I don't care what others say.
Come and sing a simple song of freedom. Sing it like you've never sung before.
All along the watchtower, princess kept the view, while all the women came and went, barefoot servants too.
Are you ready to sit by your throne? Are you ready
Not to be alone. Someone's coming to take you home.
And if you're ready, then we'll carry on. Cry, baby. Cry, baby. Say that it's over, baby. You see that it's over now. But still you hang around. Now come on, won't you move over? Going down the story, yes, I never wanted to go down the story again. Mama, let me start all over.
I ain't got nobody that I can depend on. I ain't got nobody that I can depend on. Rolling Stone. Wanna see my picture on the cover? Wanna buy 5 copies for my mother? Wanna see my smiling face on the cover? says Sylvia's busy, too busy to come to the phone. Sylvia's mother says, I just wanna testify, I just wanna testify, I just wanna testify for your love. I just wanna testify, I just wanna testify, testify for your love. I joined a rock and roll band, but don't get me wrong, there ain't no fun in games. Sometime you wonder you're gonna go insane. I said you love